Good afternoon. This is Lisa Sturdivant at the National Housing Conference and the Center for Housing Policy, welcoming you to our webinar this afternoon. I see folks are logging into the webinar, and we'll give them just a few more minutes to come in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I want to welcome you all to this webinar on using American Community Survey data to demonstrate local housing needs. Just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will have it available on our website at nhc.org. Right now, all the participants are muted, and so if you have a question, you can enter a question on your webinar screen, and we'll try and keep tabs on those questions as we go along. There'll be an opportunity actually throughout at different points of the webinar to ask specific questions about the content we're covering. So I hope you'll do so at that point as well. We'll also be having a chance during the webinar to do a little hands-on exercise using the Census website. So if you are at your computer and you do have access to a browser, we're going to be getting online at some point during the hour. So with that, I thought we would get started. Here is the agenda for today. We're going to talk about the American Community Survey and the 2010 Census. There's been some changes, and so it's a good idea to make so that we all understand the data that are available. We're going to focus really on data that are available for local areas. So this would be for neighborhoods or for cities or counties, as opposed to data that might be available for the United States or for states. We're going to go through American FactFinder, which is the primary way by which you can get American Community Survey data. Then we're going to go through an exercise where we access housing and population data for a local community. We're going to let you guys have a chance to pull data for your neighborhood. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens when you run into trouble, because there is a good chance you'll run into issues using American FactFinder. And then we'll spend just a little bit of time at the end talking about how you might present this ACS, American Community Survey data, to people in charts and how to talk about it. We're really just providing an introduction to the ACS, and the idea is to provide you with 1, 2, 3 steps for using American FactFinder to find this local data. So we're not going to talk about everything you can do with ACS data. There's a lot that you can do, and we're going to be pretty general. If you find that this is stuff you already know, please, you won't hurt my feelings if you drop off. But I would ask if you could email me topics you might be interested in for the future. So we want this to be the first of a few different workshops on using data to talk about housing needs. So if you have ideas for more advanced webinars, I hope you'll email me. So we're going to talk a little bit about presenting survey data and a little bit about margins of error and set the context for follow-up workshops. So let's go. So in 2010, there were big changes with the decennial census, which some of you may know. Starting in 2010, they discontinued the long-form questionnaire, which was replaced then by the American Community Survey. And the idea was that the ACS would allow us to have information that had been only available every 10 years from the long form every year instead. So there's no long form data from the 2010 census. So you can't get anything from the 2010 census on education or income or housing costs. That is all now available from the American Community Survey. The way I like to think about it is you can get 6 things now, 6 things from the 2010 census. These are basic demographic and housing characteristics, and you see the 6 things there. You might want to go to the 2010 census, even though it's only these 6 things, because as we'll talk about, the census is a census of everybody in the United States. So it gets a count of everybody. So this is your best place really for counts of people by age, by race, Hispanic and Latino origin, vacant and occupied units, and owned and rented units. Those are the things you can get from the 2010 census. No detailed characteristics, no summary file data, if that's a phrase you used to use from the 2000 census. All of that has been now incorporated into the American Community Survey. So the American Community Survey is a survey. So instead of a census where everybody's asked a question, the ACS is a survey that basically is collecting the same information that we got on the long form, or the SF3, from the 2000 census. And so this is all that great stuff on housing costs and poverty and children, and they've added questions about health insurance coverage. So this is where all the really rich data are now in the ACS. It's a little bit different than the census in that it's a continuous survey. So what that means is every year, in fact all the time, the American Community Survey is going on. And instead of the census, where the census collects data at one point in time, the census is administered to collect information on April 1st of the year of the census. But the ACS is a rolling survey, and about 3 million households are surveyed every year. So it's 3 million out of about 100 million households every year are surveyed. So it's a very small sample in some ways, and that has issues for the types of data that are collected. The Census Bureau began testing the ACS back in 2001 to 2004, and it's really been in operation since 2005. And the goal, the reason to switch to the American Community Survey was that so communities could have detailed population and housing characteristics every year instead of having to wait a decade. Because as is probably true in your community, things really change in 10 years. And if you're relying on data from the prior census to talk about housing needs or community needs, now you're really relying on stuff that's quite outdated. So that's the upside. There are a couple downsides with the new structure of collecting this detailed data that we'll talk about a little bit. But do know that data are now available every year for your local community. So what can we get from the ACS? So these are the things that to keep in mind, that if you want to know, can I find this in the American Community Survey? This is a good list. It's pretty comprehensive, and it's split into 4 categories. You can find data on demographic characteristics, which are listed here, so the basic people characteristics. You can find a lot of good data on social characteristics for your community. So educational attainment, school enrollment, marital status, fertility, grandparent caregivers, and veterans, disability, place of birth, citizenship, year of entry, language, and so on. So these are lots of great social characteristics that are available about people in your community. Data on economic characteristics, so this is household income, wages. There's data on receipt of benefits, including public assistance, Social Security. Data on employment, how people get to work, where they work, and the types of jobs that they have. And then finally, there's data from the American Community Survey on housing characteristics. And it's actually a pretty good source of information for housing data at the small level. Like, there are other sources of data about housing from, say, the American Housing Survey or from some other data that HUD puts out. But to get data at a neighborhood level or a community level, the ACS is actually a pretty good place to go. And you can get data on whether people rent or own, that's tenure, about occupancy, home values, rent, mortgage, other housing costs. And so we're going to spend some time looking at the kinds of housing data that are available from the American Community Survey. There's a question about whether the same individuals are surveyed every year, and that's a really good question. They are not the same people, so we're not tracking the same people year after year. What we are doing is we're getting a representative sample of 3 million households so that we can say something about the whole population for that year, but we don't want to think about it as tracking the same people. So what we're thinking about is we'll be able to say something about a population over time, these are aggregate characteristics of a population over time, but it is not the same people. And they get their address information through a fairly complicated process of compiling information from the U.S. Postal Service and a bunch of other sources, and it really is the most complete list of addresses in the country. And so they get a pretty good response rate too. They get over a 90% response rate on the American Community Survey. They were up to 96, 97% last year. And so they spend a lot of money on getting people to respond to their survey and making sure people that they get are representative of the population. So it is a random sample. And it is random in that it is used to be representative of the whole population. Couple of things to talk about, and I'm happy to have the questions about the mechanics, and if I don't get to your question during the presentation, I'll make sure to follow up with you. I mentioned this before, but I think it's really important to talk about. ACS estimates are what are called period estimates. So they're going to describe the average characteristics of a population, right, of a group of people over a specific period. So if we're looking at 2012 ACS data, for example, that's going to be, because it's a rolling survey, it's going to be an average of the characteristics of that community over the year of 2012. We're going to talk about 3-year estimates and 5-year estimates, and we'll talk about why we might look at those kinds of estimates. And they are describing the average characteristics over a 3-year period or a 5-year period. So that's something to keep in mind, because that's different than the census, which is estimates or is characteristics of an area at a very particular point in time. So I want to say a little bit more about these period estimates. There's 1-year, 3-year, and 5-year estimates. You have to use the right kind of estimates for your place. So what I mean by that is when the ACS gets done every year, it actually doesn't collect data from enough people to provide a good estimate for a really small geography every year. Basically, because of the way that it collects the data, the sample size isn't big enough to say something reliable for a small town or for a neighborhood. So what it does is instead of reporting out for that small town every year, it waits until it has 5 years worth of data, and then it summarizes all of those answers to the ACS and reports out the average of those answers for 5 years. So this is one thing you need to keep in mind. If you care about data for a small place, and a small place is a place with less than 20,000 people. So this is a small town, this is a census tract, which we'll talk about. You're going to be using what are called 5-year estimates. So your data are going to be, for the most recent period, an estimate of the characteristics of your community from 2008 to 2012. So now all of a sudden the ACS doesn't seem like as great as it was purported to be, because we get these data every year, but we have to remember that they are an average of the characteristics of a community for a 5-year period. Okay. So that means that we need to keep that in mind. So things change. Life is different in 2012 than it is in 2008, but we have a 5-year time period that we can know something about our community. So is that better than waiting a whole decade? You know, most people would say yes, but you do need to be aware that it's a trade-off. So we're going to come back to this a couple of times. You need to think about whether the place you care about is a small place, less than 20,000, a medium place, which you can see is sort of 20,000 to 65,000 people, or a big place. In a big place, we do actually have data every year. So keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that as we go through an example. it's important that as you're thinking about your geography, right, if you're thinking about your place, you need to put it in terms of the way the Census Bureau thinks about geography. And it's not always the same thing. In particular, we're gonna think about, I've circled states, counties, census tracts, and places. We're probably gonna focus mostly on counties and places and census tracts. So counties are pretty self-explanatory. Census tracts, which many of you may know, are areas that split counties and cities into smaller geographies that have usually between 1,000 or 10,000 people. So this is a small place. Okay. So a census tract is usually what we're going to use if we want to talk about neighborhoods, okay, or communities. Not like a great, it's not always what you think of as your neighborhood, but that's the best that we've got from the census. So we're going to use census tract data for neighborhoods usually. Places are a little trickier. So places include cities that aren't counties, because the Census Bureau likes to think of things in terms of counties. Places could also include towns and other areas that a state has told the Census Bureau are real places. And so there's a way that you can find the list of places or a map of places in your state. And we'll go through an example where you can see, you can type in an address and see what place the Census Bureau calls that. So keep in mind that census tracts and places are probably the kinds of geography you're going to use if you're looking at small places. So just to recap, this table shows the difference between the 2010 census and the American Community Survey and why you might use one or the other. If you want counts of people, and it's important that you have a precise count of the number of people or households in a place, go ahead and use the 2010 census. There's actually population estimates the Census Bureau does that you can then add to that and get closer to a 2011, 2012, 2013 number. But if you're interested in characteristics, like the qualities of your place, then you're going to use the American Community Survey. So I'm going to stop there as far as talking about the difference between the American Community Survey and the census. And as I move along, if you have questions about those differences, please do go ahead and pop those into the question box, and we'll make sure that we try and answer them. I want to move on to talk about American FactFinder, because American FactFinder is how we're going to access data from the American Community Survey and also from the 2010 census, so we won't focus on that quite as much. I'm going to walk through the steps on PowerPoint here, and then I'm actually going to go to the Census Bureau's website, and we're going to do an example live on the web. So bear with me as we go through some screenshots, but then we really will get to doing a live example. You're going to access the American FactFinder from census.gov. Let me say right straight up, I love the Census Bureau, and I think the Census Bureau does so much great stuff. They collect such great data. It's overwhelming to go to their homepage because there is so much out there. If you go out there now, there's all this stuff on biking to work. And so it's really fascinating. You could spend like your whole afternoon reading all this cool stuff they do. If you want to get right to American Community Survey data, I would recommend you go up to Data and then select American FactFinder from that drop-down menu. Otherwise, I mean, you can get to it a lot of different ways, but that's the easiest way. And that's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to. I'm not going to go over everything you can do on the Census website or all the different data you can access, so I'm obviously going to miss stuff. The idea is to show you things that I think have, in my experience, have been most helpful to housing planners and to other folks who want to work with local demographic data. When you click on American FactFinder, this is the main page that you're going to get. We're going to talk about community facts very, very briefly. That's very basic data that you can get for your community. We're going to spend our time on the advanced search, so don't be afraid of that. People think that's not for me. I guarantee you it is for you. This is where you want to be when you go to American FactFinder. Guided search sounds so appealing. Don't go there. And I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I've found that for folks looking for local data, the guided search can take you to a place where you can't get the information you want. And I'll tell you why in a minute. The community facts page looks something like this. I have data up here, not data, I have a screen up here for Allentown City, Pennsylvania. And so if you go to the community facts, you're going to get just a handful of tables that will tell you very basic demographic characteristics about the place you care about. So it's a good first place to start. It's not going to be super detailed, but if you think you need something very basic, you might start at the community facts page. The guided search, which again I recommended against, walks you through this way of finding census information by starting to talk about the topic that you want to look for. The reason why that's problematic is, like I said, the Census Bureau has tons of great data. Only a very small set of it are available for a local small place, right? So if you care about a neighborhood, you're going to get all excited about all this data that you think you can get, but not for a small area. You might only be able to see it for the state or for the country as a whole. So you can explore it, but it ends up oftentimes bringing you down a path where you can't get the data that you want. So I would say the advanced search is really the best place to go when you're looking for data for a small place, right, for a community. And we're going to focus on 3 parts of this screen. So we're going to focus on this Your Selections box. We're going to pay very close attention to what goes in that box, because that can make or break whether you can get the information that you want if that box is filled in correctly. We're going to talk about geographies. We're going to choose our geography first, right? We're going to choose our place first. And then we're going to choose what we care about, what we want to find out about that place. Again, this 1, 2, 3 step is really appealing over here, and I would argue that it's potential that it could lead you to a place that could be frustrating. So I'm going to do a slightly different 1, 2, 3 step that doesn't use that main screen there. And again, I love the Census Bureau, so this is not at all anything about this being a bad site. It's just, in my experience, I found sometimes there's a little bit easier way to do it. The other thing I wanted to point out, is something called data profile tables. So what I have here is a screen that is the results of an advanced search, and we're going to see this again in a minute. It's for Allentown again. And there are 4 things called data profiles from the American Community Survey that cover those 4 topics I mentioned: demographics, social, economic, and housing. There is a ton of data in these data profiles. This may be all you need. And so before you get in the weeds of all the great detailed tables that you can get from the American Community Survey, it's really helpful to spend some time with these 4 data profiles so that you can understand what you can get from those tables simply without having to go into too much detail. I'm going to show you I was going to show you the housing characteristics file, which I think I can do here, just to give you an example of what you can get from one of these data profiles. Okay, so this is actually the demographic one. So let's look at the housing one. When we go and do the exercise, you'll see how these data profiles pop up, and it's a 5-page set of information, in this case about Allentown, Pennsylvania. And this is all the basic stuff you can get, all the basic characteristics you can get about housing without doing any more work but finding this data profile table. And I'll tell you why that's important when we see how many tables American FactFinder is going to show you. So you can see there's data in here about when the unit was built, how many rooms it was, when the householder moved into the unit, how many vehicles they have, and then lots of data about housing value, about renter costs, and so on. So there's a benefit to spending a little time figuring out what's in these 4 data profile tables so that you don't spend a lot of time in the weeds on lots of detailed tables. Okay, so that's the basic information on American FactFinder. We're going to use advanced search. We can use community facts for some basic information. You can go ahead and explore the guided search, but keep in mind that sometimes you'll be looking at data that you can't find for your small area, for your small community. And so that's just one of the caveats there. So once you've once you've found out about American FactFinder, the basics, we want to know exactly how you might go about getting data. And we have a good question here about, like, how could you find data for 2012, for example, and then also for, say, 2011 or for an earlier time period? And that's a great question, and we'll go through the steps that you would do that for a particular place, because all of the data will be available for a number of different years. And we'll talk about how to think about looking for data for different years. Okay. This may not be the most popular suggestion, but I'm going to argue that before you get on American FactFinder, that you ask yourself 3 questions, and that you write the information down. Because if you write it down, it'll help you when you're actually on FactFinder. When I asked folks when they registered about whether they had experience with FactFinder, and about 1/3 of you all said that you'd used American FactFinder and it was hard to use. And you're not alone. So about 1/4 of you all said you had not used FactFinder. About 16% said you might have used it, you couldn't remember. And about 18% of you said you love FactFinder. So there's a lot of experiences with FactFinder, but I think by and large, getting confused by it is a common experience. And so one thing that I found that helps is if you spend just a couple minutes before getting on FactFinder, like very intently thinking about what you want to find out. It'll keep you from going astray when you, it won't keep, not necessarily, it'll help keep you from going astray when you get on FactFinder. So I would ask yourself these 3 questions. What area do you want to know something about? So that might be a neighborhood that, you have a particular neighborhood in mind. Keep in mind that your neighborhood isn't going to be the way the Census Bureau thinks about it, so you might want to have an address in mind that's located in that neighborhood. And I'll tell you why in a minute. You, ask yourself, are you talking about a small, medium, or big place? Because that will determine what period estimate you want. Remember, if you're looking at a small place, you're going to be using these 5-year estimates. So a place with less than 20,000 people. A medium place, between 20 and 65,000 people, you can use 3-year estimates, and then a bigger place, you can have these 1-year estimates. What information do you want to know? And is it in one of those 4 data profiles? Because if it's in one of those 4 data profiles, that'll make the process for getting the information off FactFinder much, much easier, because it'll be these 4 tables that'll pop up at the top of your list. And then what time periods do you want information for? Do you want the most recent data? Do you want data from this year and last year? Do you want to go back a decade and look at the same data from the 2000 census? So all of those things would be good to write down before you get started. So I'm going to go through the 3 steps we're going to use to get data from American FactFinder, and then we'll go and do an example online. And again, we'll have the PowerPoint available to folks so you can have these instructions and steps for you. So there's a question about why 2012 are the latest data, even though it's a rolling survey. It's a great question. The survey is rolling all the time, and what they do is they use all the answers given from January 1 of 2012 through December 31st of 2012. They take all the answers to the survey over that period, and they combine them up together, and they call that the 2012 data, right? And so all the answers that start being given on January 1, 2013, those are all going to be rolled up into the 2013 data. So they do create these annual estimates, even though the survey is going on all the time. So step 1 for accessing data from American FactFinder is we're going to pick what our geography is. We're going to click on Geographies, and we're going to either use this Address tab to type in an address to find the census place or the census tract that we care about. And then we have a couple of options. We can either type the geography name directly into a box, or we can use this drop-down list. But the most important thing is that we use this geography box first on the American FactFinder. So we'll go through that step when we hop on the census site. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to go to Topics, and we're going to click on Datasets. And we're going to choose the most recent, if that's what you want, ACS data. It'll be at the top of the list. There's going to be a lot of things in the list, and your data will be right at the top. If you want earlier data, either census data from the 2010, so I've written census summary file 1 data, or data from the 2000 census, which is the summary file 1, the basic data, or summary file 3, which is this detailed data. Those will be further down on the list, and we'll sort of take a look at them. There's going to be lots of other stuff in there, too. There may be lots of other stuff in there, too. So the second step is going to select your data set, given what you know about the size of your place and the year that you want information from. The third step, then, is you're going to select the information that you want, the characteristics that you want. Now, you've already thought about whether the information you want is in one of the data profiles. If it is, you're done. You don't actually have to do anything for step 3. You're ready to look for your information in what American FactFinder returns to you. Otherwise, so this would be if it's not basic data, but if it's really detailed, or if it's what's called crosstab data, so this is characteristics for certain groups. We're going to use the topics, and we're going to look at people and housing, and choose the topic we care about. And that will limit the tables that we have to look at that American FactFinder will tell us about. So let's do an example. So I want to look for information about the Arlandria neighborhood in Alexandria, Virginia. This is my neighborhood. So I care about finding out something about Arlandria. It's a small place because it's a neighborhood. I want to know something about the number of households that have moved in recently. And I know that on the data profile for housing, one of the main things that they list in that data profile is the number and percent of households that have moved in since 2010. So I know that's in the data profile. I'm also interested, though, in knowing something about overcrowding for folks who, for different kinds of folks. So I'm interested in overcrowding by race. And that's not in the data profile. So I'm going to have to do something a little bit more to find that. And I want the most recent data. And because I know this is a small place, the most recent data is this 5-year estimate, this 2008 to 2012 data. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to American FactFinder. And I'm going to go to guided, I'm sorry, not guided search, right? Advanced search, and it goes to show me all. So I've written down what I want to find, and step 1 is to go to geographies. And I am in this box here, and I want to find something about the Arlandria neighborhood. But again, the Census Bureau doesn't know what Arlandria is. So what I'm going to do is click on address, and I'm going to type in an address I know is in the Arlandria neighborhood. Okay, so this is something that I have to know ahead of time before I get into American FactFinder. When you type that address into this box, what is going to get returned to you is all of the census geography associated with that address. So you can find out what state that address is in, what county it's in. Virginia's weird. Some of our cities or counties. It's going to tell you what census tract, what block group, what place. It's going to tell you how that address fits into the Census Bureau's geography. And because I'm interested in a neighborhood, the census tract is really going to be my best bet. So the Arlandria neighborhood, we're going to call census tract 2012.03. I had no idea that that was the census tract I live in. And I bet very few people know what census tract I live in. But that's the geography we have to use for this neighborhood. So I'm going to click on it. And watch where it goes. It's going to go up to the top left into that Your Selections box at the top. It should. So you see this Your Selections box up here in the top left? Keep track of that. So now you've told American FactFinder that you care about this census tract. And so after you have selected your geography up here in the census tract, you have to close the geography box. And it's up here in the top right-hand corner. I tell you, it took me like 3 months to figure out that it was a pop-up box. So you click on Close to get rid of that pop-up box. Okay, that was step one, selecting our geography. I'm going to go back to geographies just for a second. Let's say instead that I was interested in the whole city of Alexandria. I could have just typed in under name, I could have just typed in Alexandria. And it gives me all the different Alexandrias in the country. And I could have selected Alexandria City, Virginia. I could have selected Go. And then what you find down here in this box is all of the census geography related to the city of Alexandria. And it's a little overwhelming, but it gives you a list of all the census tracts and all the block groups and all the zip codes in Alexandria. If I wanted to look at data just for the city, I would click on the box next to Alexandria. I would click on Add, and it's going to go up into your selections. And then I would close the geography box again. Okay, so that's a couple of different ways to get to the geography you want. I'm going to remove Alexandria City from my selections because I'm interested in my neighborhood data right now. The second step is to click on Topics and to select your data set. Now, I already know what my data set should be. It's going to be a long list of them, and the most recent ACS data are going to be at the top. And so I have to choose 5-year estimates. You see there's not even a choice to choose a 2012 1-year estimate or 3-year estimate. This is my only choice. If you scroll down, you can see there's 2000 census data down here, and then there's all the different, yeah, see, this is not correct. So you know that these are not right because you can't get 1-year and 3-year estimates for a small place. So keep that in mind. You have to be smarter than American FactFinder. And so you might catch some of those problems in the data. So I'm going to click on the data set that I care about. Okay, and the first thing I wanted to know was about the people who had moved into the area since 2010. And because I know that's in a data profile, I'm going to close this topics right now because those 4 data profiles are right at the top of my list. There are lots of tables in this list now, but the 4 data profiles are always at the top. So I can click on the housing characteristics data profile, and I can scroll down and find the fact that there are 2,343 households or occupied housing units in my census tract, and 507 of them, that is about 21.6% of them, have moved in between 2010 and 2012. It's a little bit of a weird statistic, as you can see, because it's a 5-year estimate. So that's a little bit of a strange one, but I can see lots of other information here. I can see that 17.2% of the housing units are owner-occupied in my neighborhood. So that's the data profile data, the sort of simple data. If I click back to search, that'll take me back to that screen I was at before, and I was also interested in overcrowding by race. So I'm going to unclick that table. Because that was more detailed, I need to go back to topics. And I'm doing what's called a crosstab, a cross-tabulation. I want to know a piece of information for different groups. When you want to know a piece of information for different groups, select the piece of information first. Okay, so what I mean by that is because I care about overcrowding, I'm going to click on housing, I'm going to click on occupancy, and I'm going to try and find one of these things that looks like it will get at overcrowding, because census doesn't always talk about things the way we might. I'm thinking occupants per room is not a bad table to look at. If you look in the parentheses, it says that they're going to show me 13 tables for my neighborhood about occupants per room. That's kind of a lot, but it's actually not a ton. So let's click on that and put it in the My Selections box, and we'll click on Close. And I'm going to go down here and see what the 13 tables are they showed me. And so what you can see is there's a table about occupants per room for whites, for African Americans, American Indians, Asians, and so on. So I can go ahead and click on the table, and I can find out that there are 1,542 households with a white head of household in the neighborhood I'm looking at. And of those, 93 have one or more occupants per room. And so this is the measure that Census is using to talk about overcrowding. May not be your measure, but this is the measure that they're using. So that is the basic mechanism by which you get data from the American FactFinder. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to let those of you who were online and wanted to take a turn at it, go ahead and get on American FactFinder. And I'm going to put the steps up that we just went through and let you have a crack at looking up. So we're going to do this pretty quickly so we can get on to the rest of the information. But why don't you take 3 or 4 minutes and see if you can find information from American FactFinder for your place. And if you need something to look up, you can look up the same things we just did. You can look up the number of people who have moved into your place since 2010, or you can look up the overcrowding piece, or you can just search and make sure you know how to find that data profile, because that's really the most important one. So, and as you're doing that, if you run into problems, type the question in, and we'll see if we can troubleshoot any problems that you have. So I'm going to stop talking just for a few minutes. I'm still here, but take just a couple of minutes, and then we'll get back to see how it went. So I'm going to come back now, and there were some really good questions. So I hope that you had a chance to get some data. One question that came in was, if you choose a big place and you have a choice of using a 5-year estimate, a 3-year estimate, or a 1-year estimate, how do you decide? And in general, if you have the ability to use the 1-year estimate, you should use the 1-year estimate. It's just easier to explain to people. It's 2012 data. It's not this 2008 to 2012 data. There are some exceptions when it comes to looking at very, very small places, small populations in a big place, which I'm going to say one thing about here in just a minute. One other thing is you're finding your data. Someone had raised the question of when you click on geographies, finding the address tab. It should be the last tab on the geographies box. It's not always clear where it is when you pop it up, but that is where it should be there. It should be there. I'm going to have my email address at the end of the presentation if you have other questions. But just some of the other troubleshooting things you might find if you can't find your geography. Trying that address feature lookup will really help to see what your options are. If all else fails, you can just type the county name into the name box under geographies, and the Census Bureau will show you all of the geographies within that county. I mean, there might be 100 of them, but at least you can start looking. You might have gone back to try and find 2010 census data for the same geography, and they don't always match. The geographies don't always match. So you might have to go bigger, right? So you might have to choose the county instead of the census tract. That's actually a big one. The census tracts changed between the 2010 census and the 2012 ACS, which is a big, huge bummer. But we can talk about, there's crosswalks available that you can spend a little time. And that might be a source for a future workshop that we could talk about. Sometimes you go through the process and you pick your topics and you have no tables displayed after you've selected your topics. Well, you might have picked too many things, so check your selection box and try and get rid of one of the topics. Or you might have 2 geographies in there that are inconsistent. So if you have 2 geographies in there, like one's Des Moines, Iowa, and one's Sacramento, California, it can't show you data about those places at the same time, and so it may cause you problems there. One of you asked if you can show data like for every census tract in a county, and you can indeed do that, and it will, if you look up the county in the name box and choose from the box below all tracts in county whatever, it'll show you the data for all the counties, and you can actually download that to Excel. And again, we might want to talk about that in a future workshop. There are some data in ACS that you can't get from 2010, and there's this good crosswalk that shows you the table in the ACS and the equivalent in the 2010 census. And when we have this PowerPoint available to you all, you can have that website. And then the margins of error. So this is what I wanted to talk about. And I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but I'll make sure to check in on the questions and hopefully answer them if we have time at the end. ACS is a survey, right? So a survey means that we're asking only a small group of people questions so that we can infer about a population. Surveys have error, right? And it's not error in a bad way. It's not like we did something wrong. It's not like we made a mistake and asked the wrong people. It's just that we can only ask a few people relative to the population. And so some estimates are going to be more reliable than others. And the margin of error is a measure of how reliable we think the data are. The ACS data for big places like states are going to be pretty reliable with pretty small margins of error. The data for small places are going to be less reliable, and they're going to have bigger margins of error, and we'll show an example of that. I'll come back to that making comparisons issue, but if I go back to my table that I was looking at for occupants per room in my neighborhood of Arlandria, right here I have the fact that there are 445 African-American households in this neighborhood. And you can see we have some crazy numbers here, right? We can see that there are 0 households with 1 or more occupied occupants per room, plus or minus 17. So what this means is this is not a very reliable estimate, right? So it looks like we don't have great data about this population because it's a pretty small population. If I go back, just to show you another example, if I do it for a slightly bigger population, we can see that there are about 1,005 renters that have less than 0.5 occupants per room. This is a weird statistic, so probably wasn't a good one to go down the path on, but it's a plus or minus 206. So this is another margin of error. I'm going to show you one more margin of error back on the data profile. So I'm just going back to that first data profile. And so we can see here that we have, looking for something about home ownership I was looking for, but let's do occupied housing units. So if we look at occupied housing units, we can see that 79.1% of the units in that neighborhood are occupied. And it has a margin of error of plus or minus 6.5. So I'm going to show you, you're going to actually subtract that off and add that to 79.1 to give you a sense of an interval. And that's what the margin of error really does. It gives you a range that you can be pretty confident the truth is in. And so the bigger that range, the less reliable those estimates are. And so that's something to keep in mind. And if you have a margin of error that is really big, like that first one I showed you, you have this question of, well, what do I do? So you kind of have two choices. The first is you can use the estimate and just be very cautious and say that there is a lot of uncertainty about whether this is the truth for the population, and so we're going to talk about it and use it with caution. The second thing you can do is not use it. So that's the other option. And unfortunately, those are your two best options. The third thing I'll say is you can choose a slightly bigger geography if that makes sense for you. So let's say I was interested in overcrowding, and if I could talk about the whole city, and that would be okay for what I was trying to do. If you make the population bigger, that margin of error will be a little bit smaller. So again, I just want to give you just a quick discussion of margins of errors. Block group data, for those of you who want to do mapping, or for those of you who want to look at very small areas, block group data are data for areas smaller than census tracts. Each census tract has between 2 and 4 block groups. Can't get the data on American FactFinder. You have to use this very, very crazy FTP site that the Census Bureau has. And I've put the address here. Go ahead and check it out. Could be a session for a future workshop, but that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Block group data or large data sets to use with GIS are available from the Census Bureau's FTP site. I'm going to quickly check some of the questions here. Someone asked about the difference between families and households. The Census Bureau defines a family that consists of 2 or more people related by birth, marriage, or adoption. That's a family, according to the Census Bureau. Households are unrelated people or single people living together. So that's a good question. There's another question about whether this is going to be recorded. It is. There's a question about whether you can get geographies, like zip codes, for example, within a certain distance, like a radius from an address. And you can't do that with American FactFinder. I'm going to mention another application on the Census Bureau site at the end that you can do something like that and explore a little bit. So hold that thought. Very quickly, how do you present this data? Well, you can make charts, right? You can make bar charts, for example. So this shows the households paying 30% or more of their income in rent in the city of Fredericksburg, which is a medium place, by the way. And I have the data for 2000 and for 2010 to 2012. 3 things I want to point out that you should think about, in my opinion, when you're presenting data in a chart. First, is you need a title. So make sure you have a title on your chart that has what the chart shows and the geography. Second, it's nice to have labels so that people know what the actual numbers are. And third, it's really important to have a source line. And so here's where you'll find the fact that this came from the 2010-2012 American Community Survey 3-year file. So what are we showing here? We're showing that there were 1,185 more households who were rent burdened in 2012, or the 2010 to 2012 period, compared to 2000. And that's a 54.9% increase. So that's one thing that you might want to show, is the percent change, or the actual change. Okay. So another thing you might want to show, though, is what's called a percentage point change. And I don't mean to make too big a deal out of this, but this is the same data shown with percentages. So in 2000, 42.9% of households were rent burdened. In 2012, it was 56.3%. So that is a 13.4 percentage point increase. See, that's a little bit different, and that may be what you want to show. One thing I'm going to caution you is, what do you think of this chart? So it's the same data. I'm flipping back. It's the same data, but instead of starting the bars down at 0, it's starting them at 40, and you think, wow, that shows a huge difference. That's a much better way to show it, because it shows the problem's getting hugely worse. Don't do that. So I would argue that that's a bad way to show data, because it's misleading, and you don't want to mislead people. I think that in general, the idea is to show your data starting at 0 when you're presenting percentages. Finally, this is comparing Fredericksburg to the state of Virginia. And one key thing, if we're using 3-year data, right? We're using 3-year estimates for the city of Fredericksburg because it's a medium place. Virginia's a big place, but because you're going to compare it to Fredericksburg, you need to use the 3-year file. So always use the same period estimate, even if you're comparing places that are of different sizes. And so it's going to default to the smallest place. Otherwise, you really are comparing apples and oranges because of the way these estimates work. One more thing on data and margins of error. So these are, this is different data. This is a percentage of the population with a bachelor's degree in the city of Fredericksburg and in Virginia. It's 34.9% in Fredericksburg, and it's 34% in Virginia. And so you might say, oh, well, the folks in Fredericksburg are more likely to have a bachelor's degree. But you need to keep in mind these margins of errors that I've printed out here. So the margin of error for Fredericksburg is a little bigger because it's a smaller place. And then for Virginia, it's a little bit smaller because it's a bigger place. And you need to know something about the margin of error before you can talk about whether there really is a difference. And here's what I mean by that. So when you take the margin of error, what you want to think about is that you need to subtract that from the estimate, and then you need to add it to the estimate to make a range, what's called an interval. And you do that for both of them. And it turns out that since the interval we calculated for Fredericksburg contains the interval we calculated for Virginia, these two intervals overlap. So we actually can't say there's a significant difference between the educational attainment rates of Fredericksburg folks and folks in the whole state of Virginia. You could say that, but it would be imprecise, and you might get yourself into trouble. So that's one of the reasons that the margins of error are reported, and just something to keep in mind as you're looking at the ACS data. So there's just a little bit of a review on how to use the ACS data to show change, to make comparisons, or to show percentages or counts. Okay. So are there any questions about presenting ACS data? I know that I've missed some questions. Yeah, how do you recommend talking about when mapping the data? That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that one either. But I would say, talking about margins of error, when you're talking like in a public meeting, I would have them in my back pocket. I wouldn't present them on a slide. I wouldn't, if you're talking before a planning commissioner or between an advocacy group or with a citizens group, I would have those margins of error in my back pocket. I might not spend a lot of time with them on a slide in front of a public group, would be my opinion. There is another question about actually making these kinds of charts, and I think that's a great idea for us to think about setting up a template or some step-by-step guides for making charts. So thanks for that suggestion, and I think I'd like to find a way to do that in the future. For now, though, I'm going to finish so that we can get out of here without too much going over, because I know you guys have lots to do, and it's a Friday afternoon. I wanted to share with you 4 other places you can get ACS data. HUD's CHAS data has a query tool that lets you look at data specifically by AMI. The ACS data doesn't report out by AMI. It just reports income and income groups. So what HUD's done is it's summarized ACS data for places that's bigger than a census tract, smaller than a county, for summary of cost burden households by income and by tenure. And they do this in 30% AMI, 30 to 50% AMI, and so on. It's a pretty easy to use tool. It's old data, though, unfortunately. The latest they've got up there is 2010 data. But I recommend that you check that out. On the map is the tool that I mentioned where you can draw a radius around a place and look at data, very basic ACS data, for an area that's defined a certain distance around a place. It does have pretty good data on the labor market and on income and commuting. Less good data on housing and on poverty and income. So if you're interested in workforce data or on commuting data or on basic demographic data, it's a really great tool. You can also import your own unique geography. If you have your own shapefile, you can pull it in and you can get data pulled from various data sources on the map. So that's a cool one to check out. The Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators is a nonprofit that has used ACS data combined with other local survey data and administrative data to provide neighborhood level maps and tables. I point you in this direction not because you're necessarily from Baltimore, but because it's a really great example of what you can do if you wanted to try to create like a data tool for your community and you had some expertise on web-enabled applications. So it's a really good example of that. And lastly, the Urban Institute's Housing Assistance Initiative, if you haven't seen it, is a county-level map that shows the gap between housing demand and supply for extremely low-income renters. It's ACS data, and so they've done a very cool thing where they show this gap. So another way that you can see how ACS data are being used. I really appreciate you guys staying with us for the session, and I apologize that we didn't get to all your questions. What I wanted to do is I wanted to find out what other types of workshops you might be interested in. So I've put a little poll up there, and if you could indicate any of the workshops that seem like they'd be of interest to you, that would be a real help. If there's something you're interested in that's not listed there, you'll see my email address on this final slide. I do hope you'll email me and let me know what kind of workshop related to data would be helpful for you in the work that you do in your community. And we really hope that we, with support from Capital One, do more workshops that enable housing practitioners, planners, advocates, folks working on the ground with housing issues, with community issues, can really feel empowered to use the local data that are available, and they're available for free, right? So this is a way that if you can get the expertise to use the data, it's a low-cost effort because the data are all available for free. So with that, that is all we have. We are going to have the recording available on our website, and we will also put it out as a link in an email that we will send to all of the participants. And so look for that over the next couple days. I wouldn't necessarily look for it this afternoon, but look for it early next week. And then we hope that you find it helpful as you go forward. So with that, I'll say good afternoon and have a good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you at a future workshop. Thanks a lot.